Throughout history, many atrocities have been committed under the banner of just trying to help or doing the right thing for people who can't do it for themselves. The thing is, especially when religion is involved, what's believed to be the best thing for someone may, not to put too fine a point on it, not be. Furthermore, if these good deeds are being carried out by, say, a globally established religious organisation with more money than God himself, then even if there are people out there who see the problem and want it to stop, they may just not get involved or do their best to forget about it, either because they know that taking on such a large organisation is pointless, or because they believe that, in the end, God will take care of it. The subject of today's episode very definitely contains aspects of both. So, without further ado, let us take a look into one of the more persistent stains on the fabric of history, the Magdalene Laundries. If you're old enough to be watching this video, then we can probably assume that you're aware of the process that two people must undergo in order to create a third person. Furthermore, it's probably not too scandalous to assume that the majority of people are aware that many individuals engage in that process whilst having absolutely no wish to create any more people at all. It is, to put simply, a fact of life, even if it's not one that we like to traditionally discuss in polite conversation. Unfortunately, procreation for recreation can go wrong, especially in communities whose religious beliefs forbid the taking of precautions, and although men can, and often do, absolve themselves of all responsibility, either through denial or disappearing altogether, the consequences for a young, religious, unmarried, pregnant woman with no means of supporting her baby are much more serious. During the 18th century in both the UK and Ireland, this, along with rampant prostitution, was a big problem. After all, unwed mothers with hungry children place huge financial strain on the public purse, and women who were so poor that they had no other option than to sell their bodies littering the streets isn't a good look for anywhere. Obviously, something had to be done about all of this, and in 1767, something was. 2 years after the idea was initially proposed, on Leeson Street in Dublin, the Magdalene Asylum for Penitent Females opened its doors for the first time. Its stated purpose? To help rehabilitate fallen women. For those of you who are not familiar with the delicacies of religious rhetoric and terminology, the term fallen women officially meant those who had sunk so low as to prostitute themselves. In reality, though, the net expanded very quickly. As the popularity of such institutions increased, and many more opened across Ireland, the UK, and even the United States, the term fallen women began to include basically anything that could possibly be considered undesirable at that time. A bit of a wild child, off to the laundries. Disobedient, off to the laundry. A victim of rape who had inconveniently fallen pregnant and couldn't support the child, you guessed it, off to the laundries. The women who were unfortunate enough to find themselves inside one of these buildings quickly discovered them to be little more than forced labour camps. The following are extracts taken from the testimony of survivors. Mary Gaffney, a child born in one of Ireland's equally infamous mother and baby homes and later forced into service at St Vincent's Laundry, said this about the nuns and her time there. "You did what you were told. Don't speak out. God, they were nasty enough, girl. I didn't care for them when I was working with them. Hard work." Another former resident who entered one of the laundries at aged 14 said of the average workday, "There were great big heavy rollers. The sheets would be red hot. It would be the work of an adult man. I was up at 6 in the morning, and every time the bell rang, you went where you were told to go. I didn't know how old I was. There were no mirrors, and birthdays were never celebrated." And Elizabeth Coppins, in this slightly longer extract, gives us an idea of what the non-working conditions were like. "I wasn't even 15. I hadn't even kissed a boy, and I was taken into the so-called Magdalene Sinner's place. At night time, we were all locked in this cell. This was Peacock Lane in Cork. Literally, they were like prison cells. And on the outside, there was a bolt, and once you went in there at night, the bolt was shut from the outside, and you couldn't get out. If you were sick, it was tough, and you had to wait until the nun came around at 6 o'clock the next morning to open the bolt for you to get up and get dressed. If you wanted to go to the toilet, you had a pot. I mean, come on. And these were women. It was degrading. I was 15. There were women in there older than me now. I'm 69, and they had to use a pot. In the morning, we had to get out and slop out, and the stench was just unbearable. I feel sick even thinking about it right now. Unfortunately, this is just scratching the surface. Although these laundries were publicly declared to be an absolutely voluntary experience, a safe alternative to living on the streets, where you would be able to both earn your keep and repent in the eyes of the Lord, this did not remain the case for very long. You see, laundry bills can be expensive, and in the time before the disposable industry took full hold, hospitals, prisons, etc. had even more of it to get done than they do now. If only there were some way that they could continue to get all state paid for laundry done to the high standards of nuns for a minimal price, almost indefinitely. But how could this be arranged? After all, if the public found out that the women who were meant to be being helped were in fact being exploited, then fewer people would condemn their fallen women to this life. Eventually, the government hit upon the perfect solution. Not only would it be possible to volunteer yourself or your family members to the laundries, the courts would send them there as well, blurring the line between social problem and criminality into invisibility. The Magdalene Laundries became an extension of the justice system. Although judges wouldn't usually sentence miscreants to hard labour, what they would do is issue probation orders which placed the women under the control of religious institutions, and from there it was an easy step for them to be disappeared into whichever laundry needed them the most. Remember, the idea of these probationary periods was to help rehabilitate criminal or psychologically damaged individuals so that they could eventually reintegrate into society. On the off chance that any of the condemned women did actually have anything wrong with them, the institutions had no expertise, training, or skill sets to actually help. To give you an idea as to just how many people were affected by this, according to the Irish government's own interdepartmental report on state involvement with the Magdalene Laundries, which was published in 2013, more than a quarter of all admissions came directly from state agencies, including the courts, police, known as the Gardaí, and social services. Without question, prison would have been better. At least when you're in prison, you can look forward to getting out at a specified time. This was not necessarily the case in the laundries, and there are more than a few instances of young girls entering at around the age of 14 and literally never leaving. Although it was technically possible to escape, that is of course assuming that you had someone on the outside who cared enough about you to track you down and fight for your release, leaving was, shall we say, strongly discouraged. One survivor, interviewed as part of the Justice for Magdalene's campaign, recalled that when she was finally allowed to leave after years of forced labour, her only instruction from the nuns was to walk to the nearest bridge and throw herself off. There are thousands of pages of testimony and countless hours of video footage documenting the suffering of these individuals in shocking detail, but we think you get the point. Now it's time to have a look at just exactly how these atrocities finally stopped. Although rumours of mistreatment had been around since the project's inception, the majority of people, especially when their own religious faction is involved, tend to bury their heads in the sand to, quite frankly, a terrifying degree. Phrases like, "It can't possibly be true," "Something would have been done about it by now," or "These people are sinners, how can you trust anything they say?" are the apologists' bread and butter. Nevertheless, as the 80s drew to a close, public opinion was beginning to turn. Many survivors had finally managed to get media outlets to take them seriously, and a few brave individuals had even written books about their experiences. Still, it's doubtful that the true horror would have ever been fully exposed if it weren't for a discovery made in 1993. A graveyard on land at High Park, Drumcondra, belonging to the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity, was being exhumed because the land had been sold to a property developer. According to the Department of the Environment, in accordance with regulations, a license was issued to remove 133 named women. Unfortunately, when the team of undertakers began work on the project, it transpired that there were quite a few more than that. The Irish Times claimed that, but the firm of undertakers carrying out the exhumations had to stop work when the remains of an additional 22 women were found. A further exhumation license was issued on August 31st, 1993 to take out all human remains. The Department of the Environment has said that death certificates were provided in only 75 of the cases covered by the initial exhumation license. The General Register Office issued no trace forms for 34 other cases and said it could not conduct a search of the remaining 24 as insufficient details were provided. This is far more serious than a simple case of failing to file the correct paperwork. In fact, it went a long way to proving that the stories were true. Many survivors had claimed over the years that upon entering the laundries, they were stripped of their identities to such a degree that they were either issued new biblical names or not referred to by name at all. And the fact that many of the unregistered corpses were either anonymous or simply referred to as Magdalene of St. Teresa or Magdalene of Lourdes indicates this was true. In addition, the fact that all of the unidentified remains were very quickly cremated without the sisters appearing to make any effort when it came to returning the bodies to the correct families added further fuel to the fire. There must have been something they were hiding. Finally, the cat was out of the bag. Newspapers quickly picked up the story and ran with it, causing genuine public outcry, and a number of investigations were conducted. In true government style, the most notable of these investigations, known as the McAleese Report, would not be released to the public until 2011, but when it was, it confirmed everything that people had been saying all along. That women had been detained against their will, that they worked for no pay under brutal conditions, and that the Irish state had been fully complicit in referring women to the laundries and in funding their operations, and that, despite decades of suffering, there had been no compensation, no apologies, no attempt at justice. 2 years later, just 19 years after the final Magdalene Laundry had closed its doors for good, Ireland issued an official apology to everyone who had been wronged. On the 19th of February, then Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, stood before the Irish Parliament and issued a formal state of apology to the Magdalene women. He described the laundries as a cruel, pitiless island and spoke directly to the survivors. On behalf of the state, the government and our citizens, I apologise unreservedly and wholeheartedly for the hurt that was done to you, for any stigma you suffered, and for the failure of the state to intervene and to put a stop to it. Most unusually for situations like this, it did not appear to be a speech purely designed to make the problem go away. The government established a redress scheme which included financial compensation, access to healthcare, and support services for survivors. And while for many women this came far too late, it did mark the first real moment of national reckoning. If people had been expecting the same unequivocal apology from the various religious institutions involved, then they were destined to be disappointed. To this day, they have all been remarkably reluctant to take accountability, and even more reluctant to provide any sort of financial recompense. The only person who appears to have come close to apologising was Pope Francis, who in 2018, during a speech at Dublin Castle, issued an all-encompassing acknowledgement of the various wrongs committed against the Irish people by the Catholic Church. In place of Christian charity, forgiveness and compassion, far too often there was judgment, severity and cruelty, in particular towards women and children and those on the margins. Magdalene Laundries, mother and baby homes, industrial schools, illegal adoptions and clerical child abuse are stains on our state, our society and also the Catholic Church. A nice gesture, no doubt, but at the end of the day, talk is cheap. Make no mistake though, the stories of the Magdalene Laundries are not some ancient relic of the past. Many people still feel direct or indirect effects to this day. As one survivor told us during a brief telephone interview, "I was lucky. I got out in '85 and was able to live a pretty normal life. To this day though, I still have nightmares and the occasional panic attack. It's not just the abuse we suffered, it's the institutionalized shame. I met John, my husband, in 1994 when this was all big in the news, and I was too ashamed to tell him that I had been there. It took me another 10 years before I could tell him I'd been there." Yep, the laundries are gone now, but they have left an indelible stain on the psyches of survivors and the families of those who were not so lucky. We like to think of ourselves as better, more refined and enlightened than the people of the past. But one of the most dangerous traits of humanity is complacency. Remember these women, remember what happened to them, and remember the dangers of out of sight, out of mind. People knew about this, they knew it was happening, but because of the shame associated with having a family member in the laundries, combined with the belief that the church would do the right thing, they did nothing.